Ruth Cuthand was born in 1954 in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, which is located on Treaty 6 land. At a young age, her family moved to Cardston, Alberta, near the Kainai Nation's primary reserve, Blood 148. She is of Plains Cree and Scottish ancestry.
She began her studies at the University of Regina in 1977 and then earned a Bachelor in Fine Arts in 1983 from the University of Saskatchewan. She earned her Master's degree in Fine Arts in 1992 also at the University of Saskatchewan. Also briefly did some postgraduate work at the University of Montana in 1985.
As a child living in Cardston, Alberta, she met artist Gerald Tailfeathers, which influenced her interest in art at an early age. In one of her artist statements, Ruth says that after meeting Gerald Tailfeathers, her first art materials included the orange paper that was discarded in the processing of the Polaroid chest x-rays that were given to students annually in routine tuberculosis screenings. Ruth Cuthand consistently infuses her Cree indigeneity into her artwork. She likes to blend traditional and contemporary art together, and in doing so, she uses this art to create discussion on various historical traumas endured by a diverse set of Indigenous communities. Cuthand explores healing within these various Indigenous communities while providing honest representation regarding main discussion points on the Indigenous peoples of Canada. So I've actually done my fair share of research on smallpox, and when looking at Ruth Cuthand's artwork and what she may be trying to represent, smallpox absolutely devastated Indigenous communities, and part of this devastation was because they didn't have any prior exposure to the virus or immunity to the virus, and so obviously this led to massive population declines, which also kind of coincides with community collapse. And another thing that I researched was the enduring physical and mental trauma that Indigenous people endured. Smallpox sometimes left survivors with disfigurement, blindness, and then also you guys have to think about the psychological trauma of witnessing mass death and suffering.
Thank you, Daussen, for your inference on Ruth's art piece of smallpox. Now we're going to move on to the artwork on the right side of the screen, and I'm going to make an inference. Okay, first let's look at the title. Tuberculosis. This is a disease that affected many Indigenous peoples throughout history. Just like smallpox, it killed many. I believe that Ruth is conveying the idea of how tuberculosis extremely affected Indigenous people and is highlighting the assimilation of Indigenous people in history.
So Cardston, Alberta actually has a pretty prevalent Indigenous Mormon community, and Ruth Cuthand has intertwined this into her work multiple times. Her artwork also provides personal and outside perspectives that focus on the impact of colonization, residential schools, and systemic inequality. So when looking at this series, called the Cardston, Alberta series, I think Ruth was kind of trying to depict what she saw growing up in Cardston, Alberta, which as expressed was a huge Mormon population. I ended up doing some research into Mormonism after looking at Ruth's background and where she grew up, and found that Mormons viewed Indigenous people as a thing called Lamanites in the Book of Mormon. And essentially what they believed is that Lamanites, or Indigenous people, are one day going to basically convert to the Mormon faith and help Mormons rebuild New Jerusalem, which is, funny enough, located in the United States in Jackson City, Missouri. And so I think she just tried to show the diversification of her community and growing up and kind of what she saw. And actually, I do know that I'm pretty sure the church in the back is the massive Mormon church that is located in Cardston, Alberta.
Here we will listen to a snippet of a story from Ruth. Ruth's father and her drove up to the blood reserve where her family resided. Ruth and her father explored a shack in which there laid an empty bed frame in which the mattress was completely deteriorated and all that was left was springs. Underneath the bed laid a pile of blue glass beads. Ruth had the assumption that someone once laid there. Now Ruth will share her takeaways from her experience.
Whoever had been laid out there was gone. There was no remnants of a human. There's no bones. There's no teeth. There was no mattress on this bed. Everything had just disintegrated, or animals had taken off with it, or whatever. But underneath the springs of the bed were these blue beads. And they were all, there's like a mass at the headboard of the bed And I remember looking at those and figuring out that it was a woman who had been laid out there, and that she had been wearing a cape, a beaded cape, not the kind of cape that white people think of, but a different kind of cape. And it had disintegrated. The hide had gone, the thread, and all that was left under that bed was this mass of blue beads. And I remember thinking, that woman is gone. There's nothing left of her except for these beads. And I was totally fascinated with the idea that there can still be a mark of a woman, even though everything is gone. You can tell she was still there.
So some of the main awards and special acknowledgements regarding Ruth Cuthand's career include receiving the Saskatchewan Lieutenant Governor's Art Award in 2013. She is the alumni of Influence by the College of Arts and Science at the University of Saskatchewan in 2015. And she also received the Governor's Award in Visual and Media Art in 2020.
In 2021, she received an honorary doctorate from the Ontario College of Art and Design University. Cuthand has also curated works for several galleries across Canada, including Mediating Violence for Tribe Inc. and AKA Gallery in 2002, and served on peer juries from the Canada Council and the Saskatchewan Arts Board.
In terms of community connections, Ruth Cuthand has done a great job over the course of her career integrating Indigenous art into mainstream society and showing people that aren't familiar with Indigenous art what it entails and the traditional practices behind it.
Ruth Cuthand's Don't Breathe, Don't Drink directly highlights the crisis that happened on a First Nation in Northern Ontario, in which they were experiencing a housing crisis due to black mold. Ruth beaded the bacteria and parasites that are found in 94 First Nations that currently have to boil their water to be able to drink it. Ruth put these beaded parasites and bacteria into resin in all sizes of glasses and baby bottles to show the world how these communities were struggling to have clean drinking water and bring light to the crisis that is hidden beneath our eyes.
Ruth Cuthand took a residency position at the University of Saskatchewan Health Sciences Department. She used her beading to highlight how the arrival of European traders' viruses decimated Indigenous populations in Canada as well as North America. Ruth Cuthand educated students for over 20 years at the First Nations University of Canada. Over the course of her time there, she taught art as well as art history.
In February of 2019, during her residency at the University of Saskatchewan, Ruth helped lead Indigenous Achievement Week. During that time, she led an interactive art project called Beads in Stone. Ruth and Woodlands Cree artist Vanessa Hygen beaded with participants and created extended opportunities for students and people from various ethnic backgrounds. The drop-in group became extremely popular and provided non-Indigenous people of Canada to experience such a critical part of Indigenous art and culture. The success of her beading groups led to an expansion of the program that took place at USask, where Cuthand now offers 3-hour beading groups for students multiple times a week.
For our lesson, we decided to pick a Grade 6 Arts Education Outcome and Indicator. CH 6.2 is Identify ways that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit artists express cultural identity in contemporary work. The indicator says, analyze and discuss how artists reflect cultural identity in their work.
To begin, ask your students what is cultural identity.
You can also introduce or reintroduce the idea that Métis, First Nations, and Inuit people use art to reflect identity, tradition, and personal experiences.
At first, you can lead a whole group discussion where you analyze multiple pieces of Ruth Cuthand's artwork. Ensure to discuss the emotions the artists may have been feeling as well as what stories they may be telling. This can lead to asking how their art might tie into their cultural identity.
After you lead your whole group discussion, the last activity can have you getting your students to create their own pieces of artwork that explores and reflects their cultural identity. You can quickly brainstorm ideas as a class that may help your student meet their learning objectives. Ideas written on the board may include colors, words, or imagery that reflects their background, interests, or family. As students are working, you can go around the room and help any students that may need scaffolded support to meet the learning objectives.
To end your lesson, ask the students why doing this may be important. Share with them the importance of sharing your identity and culture and continuing to diversify society.